So, anyway, we're in Exodus. We're going to look at verses 16 and 17 of chapter 23. And it says this. It says, celebrate. Let me start again. It says, celebrate the festival of harvest with the first fruits of the crops that you sow in your field. Celebrate the festival of ingathering at the end of the year when you gather in your crops from the field. 3 times a year, all men are to appear before the sovereign Lord. So let's pray, and we'll dig into the text here. Gracious God, thank you for your word. Thank you for opportunities to worship. Thank you for a healthy birth of Theo. Thank you for how you have blessed Judy and her family. God, I pray that just in this time that it would be your words, not Sam's, and that whatever you want to say to each person here would be what you would say. That you'd quiet our hearts, our minds, and just use this time as you would see fit. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right, several years ago, I'm getting old, so several years can mean quite a few years, but I'd say, I know the movie came out in 2013, so it's less than 10. I saw this movie. It was called Camp, and this movie Camp is a movie about Royal Family Kids Camp. That's what it looks like if you say, oh, I want to look at what that movie is. There's all sorts of movies called Camp. This is the one. It came out in 2013. And this movie talks about, there's a couple different main characters. One of them is a guy who goes in and is a counselor at camp. And it kind of walks through his story of how he got into counseling at camp and kind of what happens in his life and what God does in his life through that camp. Then there's the story of another young man in this, and his name is Eli. Eli grew up in an abusive household. His mom passes away, and he's at camp and just lashing out at a bunch of people. At anybody who wants to try and get close to him or whatever. He's resistant. And as the time goes on, they get to a season of the week, a part of the week, where they have a talent show. And in this talent show, the kids all do their thing and all. And then it gets to, as they're getting ready to wrap up, the director of the camp invites this counselor up onto camp, and she reveals that she has his drum set from high school up on the stage. And she invites him to come up, and in true cheesy fashion, she says something like, come up and rock out or something like that. And I don't know. But anyway, he comes up, he plays his drums. The kids are all loving it and having a blast. But before he starts playing his drums, he tells his story. And his story briefly was that this is a drum kit that his dad gave him as a birthday gift. And this birthday gift meant a lot to him because his dad never told him that he loved him. But this was a drum kit that let him know kind of that Dad did love me. But he said as life went on, he kind of hadn't played it, and as a result, his mom had given it away and the camp had it. And so he plays, and afterwards he's talking to his camper, named Eli. And he's talking about it, and Eli tells him, I hope I have the exact words were, I hope I get a birthday present someday. My mom said I never deserved one. And as the movie goes on and time goes on, this counselor decides to throw a party. And so he throws a party for the entire camp. Every kid gets a gift, including Eli. In fact, he gives Eli the drumsticks. Spoiler alert if you're going to watch the movie. He gives Eli the drumsticks for his drum set, and Eli's got this drum kit that's going to be his. And then they set up a bunch of inflatables, and they just have a day of partying and celebrating the kids as a birthday party because Eli had never had a birthday party. What's interesting is as you get to the end of this movie, it talks a little bit about the people who started Royal Family Kids and some of the experiences in the early years of camp. And one of those is a gentleman gives kind of his story. His name is Glenn Garvin. He's a former camp director, and he was, at the time, the vice president of Royal Family Kids Camps. And he says that he was at a camp one year and found himself complaining that he was missing his birthday. Now, this is an adult, not a kid, but this is an adult, a married adult, actually, and complaining, he's like, I'm here over my birthday. And he said that as he was there, he started to hear a kid say, well, I've never had a birthday. And then he found out that none of the kids that they had brought to camp that year had ever celebrated a birthday. They had never experienced what it was to have a birthday party. And so that's kind of what spawned this in this movie. Now, this affects Royal Family Kids Camps to this day. One of the things that, there's a number of people that have been connected to the Rescue Church that have been involved in Royal Family Kids Camps. All of the Fricky girls have been involved in it. All of my family, except me, has been involved in it. If you know Jamie and Brianna Von Eye, Brianna's been involved in it. Bradley's been involved in it. A number of people connected to the Rescue Church have been involved in Royal Family Kids Camps. And to this day, they are intentional about one day a week making sure that every kid gets to experience a birthday party. Because the reality is some of these kids don't have parties. They haven't grown up in a family that has celebrated them and has taken the time to celebrate. And you'll see some of the pictures here of their celebrations. And I think Miriam said all of these passed as safe photos so they don't show any kid's face. But they have a big party, and it starts, as I understand it, and I should have had one of my family members talk about it, but it sounds like it starts at the beginning of the day, and it's everybody's birthday. You greet everybody with happy birthday as you see them throughout the day. The day is a party. They have a big birthday party. Every kid gets gifts. You can see they have just a party atmosphere. They do different things throughout the day, all day long. So every kid gets to experience a celebration of their life and who they are. And I think that we can look at this and go, that's so sad and so tragic that these kids haven't had that opportunity to celebrate. And at the same point in our own lives, sometimes we get so busy pushing forward, so busy going, that we don't take time to stop and celebrate. We don't take time to stop and remember the things that God's done for us, the good things that have happened in our lives, because we've got that next thing to tackle. Whether it's in the church and we've been praying that people would come to Jesus, and we start to see people come to Jesus, but it wasn't as many as we hoped, and if we stop to celebrate too long, we're going to miss on the other one, so we got to just keep going. And we keep pushing ourselves forward as a church. Maybe it's a building project. You know, I'm really happy to see that the building is starting to get some more work done to it, and we're getting updated, and it's going to make a better impression to our community, which is great. But then there's more stuff to do, and I find myself saying, yeah, we're going to get this done, and then we've got other things to do. But I want to be careful about not stopping to celebrate and stopping to be thankful for the things God's done for us as a church. In our lives, it can be the same thing. You know, yes, I got a paycheck this week, but I got to get another one, so I got to get back to work. I got to get this thing done. Oh, I had all these great sales, but I got to get more sales because I need to continue to build business. Oh, my business had a good week, but I got next week coming, and there's always the next thing. And we can find ourselves constantly pushing forward. In the ag world, it can be, we had a great year, but I got to start marketing, I got to start buying for next year. Or we had a terrible year, so I got to start marketing and start buying for next year. We always find a reason to keep pushing ourselves, to keep going forward. But some of us, and not all of us, but some of us struggle to stop and reflect and celebrate. That's not God's best for us. In fact, what we see here in the Old Testament, as far back as God's children of Israel and bringing them out of Egypt, is that He has designed us to celebrate. He has designed us to remember and to reflect. In this passage, it talks about in verse 17 that there are 3 times that they have pilgrimages to Jerusalem. There was 3 festivals, 3 major festivals, where the people had to have such a big celebration, and this was God's direction to them, that He wanted them to have such a big celebration that they didn't just hang out at home and say, yay, a little party. They all got together for this massive family reunion in Jerusalem. Now, I know Judy's got 40-some grandkids, so I'm guessing those family reunions are big, but they're nothing compared to all of Israel getting together at one time in one place to party and to celebrate. So God brings all of these people together 3 times a year. They were to get together and have these celebrations. If you look and read your Bible in the Old Testament now, and you have an Old Testament too, but if you read the Old Testament, you will find that never, and if I'm wrong, correct me please, but never in any of the times when they are celebrating a festival or a celebration that God's called them to do, were they ever attacked. This nation of Israel, whenever they took time, it said that all the men were to leave their towns and go to Jerusalem to celebrate. And in none of those situations where all of the men were gone, did people go, oh, I'm going to take on this part of Israel. I'm going to conquer this part of Israel because they're vulnerable. Never. In every one of those, God protected Israel. I just bring this up because I think sometimes part of our reason for not celebrating is we think it's all about us. My guess, and I won't point fingers unless it's at myself, my guess is that some of you in here do a terrible job at celebrating Sabbath. Maybe I'm wrong, but my guess is some of you would tell me all sorts of reasons why you can't take a day of rest one day a week. I mean, you've got a lot going on, and it's legit. You've got families to raise. You've got businesses to run. You've got sales to make. I get it. But that same God that protected Israel at the time when everybody was to leave and get together is a big enough God that he can take care of your sales, your family, your business, your career. And so I would challenge that sometimes for myself, the reason I don't take time to rest like I should is because I'm focused on, I need to do this. I have to have this. If I don't do this, this isn't going to get done. These sales don't help themselves. This community doesn't reach itself. I have to be doing something. When in reality, there is a loving God who has done some pretty big things. I mean, last I checked, he created the earth in 6 days, and yet he still took time to rest. And if it was important enough for him to do, you and I might want to consider it as well. But anyway, that was just a side note. That's not the message. So getting on to some of these feasts, I thought, well, it mentions there's times that they get away for celebration. Let's look at what they are. Here's what you'll find. If you start celebrating feasts, it gets really confusing because all these feasts have all sorts of different names that they're known by. And some feasts overlap. So we'll try and cut through some of these pretty quickly. The first one that we're going to look at is the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Now, the Feast of Unleavened Bread was a time when they were to get together and remember that God had brought them safely out of Egypt. If you remember the story, the Israelites were all serving in Egypt. They had gone there with Joseph, and God had blessed them, and they had done really well, which made the Egyptians really nervous. So the Egyptians start making them their slaves and giving them more and more work to do and more work to do. And eventually, there comes to a point where there's plagues. If you remember the plagues, there's a song about it. We won't sing it today. But there's these plagues that come, and the last plague is that the oldest child in every house is going to die, unless the blood of a lamb is put on the doorpost. And there's some other things that went with that, but that was the basics of it. And those who did, the families were spared, they were saved. And at that point, all of the Jews leave Egypt. This Feast of Unleavened Bread is a time when they're remembering that. In fact, Passover is part of this feast. This feast is a 7-day thing, if I remember correctly. And the first day is Passover. Passover, the time when they remember the blood that was put on the doorpost. Okay, the next feast that we talk about is called Feast of Weeks. This is another one of the feasts where they traveled. It was Feast of Weeks. This is where I started to get confused. I'm a simple person. I started to get confused because it's also called the Feast of Harvest. It's also called the Feast of First Fruits, which is what we saw here. It's also called Shavuot or something along that line. And it's also called Pentecost. So you may have heard of any one of those or all of those, but those all go together. And this Feast of Weeks is a Feast of Harvest. Now, this also gets confusing because there's more than one Feast of Harvest. So, like I said, simple-minded. And so for me, I had to go through and write this down. So hopefully this will help a little bit. This feast was one that opened the season of harvest. It opened the time of celebrating what God had provided. And it opened by celebrating the harvest of wheat. So wheat was what was celebrated at this Feast of Weeks or Pentecost or Feast of Harvest or whatever we want to call it. Now, this appears to have been set up by God as a time for them to remember his provision for them. Remember, he is Jehovah Jireh. He is the God who provides, and they're celebrating his provision. Now, as time has gone on, Jewish history tells us that this also became significant as a time when they remembered the fact that God had given them his law. He had given them his rules, his regulations for them to live by. And so while we don't actually see that spelled out in the Old Testament as such, it seems to have carried on for generation after a generation. So it's widely believed to be that was part of it, as well as a time of reflecting on the fact that God had cared so much that he gave them his law, his instructions that would guide their lives. And so they were celebrating that and remembering that as well. Now, Pentecost, which is part of this Feast of Weeks, was set up as a single day. Now, as I was reading about it, it seems like sometimes it's celebrated over 2 days because of the way the days run, and there was some confusion on which day specifically it was supposed to be celebrated. So some Jews celebrate it today on 2 different days, but it was initially set up as a single day. And then the third festival in these major festivals was the Feast of Booths, or the Feast of Tabernacles, or the Festival of Ingathering, or Sukkot, as I probably slaughtered, but Sukkot? Sukkot, there you go. Sukkot. That makes a lot more sense than the way I said it. Anyway, so that feast, that festival was also, like I said, called the Festival of Ingathering, which is where I started to get confused, because I'm like, wait a sec, didn't we just have a Feast of Harvest? What's this Feast of Ingathering? And this was celebrating a different harvest. This was the harvest of like the fruits of the vines, specifically olives, but potentially grapes as well, were celebrated at this time. This was probably the most fun and the most celebratory of all of them. It seems like this was the biggest party. My words, that's not, God didn't say, hey, you're going to have a party. Maybe he did, but that wasn't what I was basing it on. But it was this festival of celebration and fun and having a great time wrapping up the agricultural year and celebrating how God had provided over that year. You'll notice that not all of these celebrations were the same. And in fact, there were other festivals that were covered. There was a festival that not everybody traveled to Jerusalem, called Yom Kippur, or the Day of Atonement. This may have been the most holy of the festivals. It looked ahead to a coming Messiah. And this isn't my kind of party, I don't think, but they celebrated with a fast. So their party included not eating. But at the end of the day, at sundown, as they broke their fast, there was a big meal celebrating that day as well. There's another festival. If you've been reading through your Bible with us, you would have read about it this last week. It's in the book of Esther. This one wasn't actually one that God had ordained for them, but one that, at least there's no record of him ordaining it, but it was actually set up by Esther and Mordecai. And it's Purim. This is a festival remembering how God delivered his people in those times with Esther and Mordecai. So that was another festival there was. But in our lives, there's different reasons we celebrate, and they're not all going to be the same. They're not all going to be as big as others, but we still have an opportunity to celebrate. I love what Ecclesiastes says. Ecclesiastes is a challenging book to read, also in the Old Testament, written by Solomon, one of the wisest men to ever have walked the earth. And I'm going to hit on 2 verses, verse 1 and verse 4. Verse 1 says, "There is a time for everything and a season for every activity under the heavens, a time to weep, a time to laugh, a time to mourn, a time to dance." We have seasons each of us go through. Some of them are great and times of celebration. Some of them are times of sadness and sorrow. Interestingly, yesterday at the wedding, I had a number of people ask, where my family was or what was going on. And we had 2 different ends of this spectrum going on. I had the privilege of going and celebrating a new marriage and a couple that God had brought together and looking forward to what God's going to do. At the same time, Eve's in Minnesota at a funeral, remembering somebody who their life was ended too short due to illness. But there's seasons for everything. There's seasons that are a party, a celebration. There's even seasons at that funeral they were intentional about having it a celebration of life. Not just mourning what had happened, but celebrating the way she had impacted the people around her, her family and others. There's a reason and a season for celebrate. Now, for us, sometimes we fail to take time to celebrate. And that's really the main purpose of this message. The main point of this message is that we need to take time to celebrate. We need to take time to have fun. We need to stop being so busy all the time and take time enjoying what God has done and what God has given us. A friend of mine who is a farmer, every year, usually in December, has a big harvest party for all of their workers and everybody that's a part of their farm. And I find it interesting because I've seen this celebration over many years. And you know what happens? They have a great party after a great year where they've had some, I've seen them have years where their yields were amazing and things were awesome. And they have this party and they celebrate all that's happened and they all just have a good time. But I've also been there on a year where harvest was terrible. They lost a lot of money. And at the same point, they still had a party celebrating what they had harvested and celebrating what God had brought them through. Sometimes, for you and for me, we come up with that, well, yeah, but it wasn't that good. Even in the life of this church, I can remember times where we had goals that we were shooting for, and we didn't necessarily hit those goals. And we just keep pushing and we keep pushing, when really we probably should have stopped and celebrated, because God was still doing something. It may not have been what we thought he was going to do, but he had still done something. We and not just the Rescue Church, many churches will set goals for how many people they're going to reach, how many seats they're going to fill, how many services they're going to have, how many buildings they're going to build. And when you don't hit that, it can be tempting to say, oh, I don't even want to think about it, I'm not even going to talk about it, we're just going to move on. Instead of celebrating how far we've come. Instead of celebrating what we've done and what we've been through. And where we're at today. And the fact that the God who was faithful in the past is faithful in the present and will be faithful in the future. That's what Israel was celebrating. They were celebrating a God who has been faithful. They were reflecting and remembering the fact that there is a God that had brought them out of Israel. So regardless of whatever hardship they faced, whatever challenge they faced, as they had these festivals, there was a reminder and a celebration that God had done this in the past, he could do it in the present, and he would continue doing it for years to come. There was celebrations about things they had received. You realize that these were celebrating harvest, celebrating what they had been provided to them, what they had provided to them. They were remembering God as Jehovah Jireh, the God who provides. There was the celebration of what God has brought them through that we talked about. And there was also a celebration of what God had done for them. It's similar to what God had brought them through, but yet it was a little bit different. And when I say a celebration of what God has done for you. An example for us is what we're going to do today is communion. God himself, Jesus himself, God in human form, came to earth, lived a life that none of us could live. This was what one of those feasts was looking forward to, was the coming of a Messiah. And we have a chance to celebrate that Messiah who has come. And even as I was talking to Jess before the service today, sometimes we in the Rescue Church, and you can point the finger this way, forget to take time, or maybe not even forget, but just don't take time to probably celebrate as often as we should communion. Remembering the fact that there is a God who loved us enough to send his son Jesus to come to earth, to live a life that you and I couldn't live, to die a death that you and I deserve to die because our sin has consequences. Yet he dies for us, takes on himself the sins of you and of me and of people to come and people that have come before, so that we could have a relationship with him, so that we could have hope, so that we could have rest, so that we could have peace. And so that's part of the reason we're going to celebrate today, is because of something that God has done for us. There's feasts even looking ahead to what God was going to do, and celebrations of what God would do in the future. Some parties were big, some were small. This isn't saying that everything has to look the same, but encouragement for us to remember the story of Eli in that RFK camp video. We can get so busy, or we can be so hung up on things, that we don't get a chance to have those celebrations, those parties, those fun times. And God is not a stick in the mud. God is not some boring God, that ho-hum God. I think we incorrectly communicate to people that there is this God that is sitting there as judge going, you screwed up? You screwed up? You failed to check the boxes that I gave you? Don't you know that I gave you a list of do's and don'ts? And we get hung up on this God who is all about the do's and all about the don'ts and all about the rules and the regulations. And while that same God has those there, it's not because He desires to give us rules and regulations. It's because He loves us and He wants what's best for us. And He wants us to make the most of this life that He has given us. But we can get so hung up on that we portray to a world an idea of a God who doesn't have any fun, who lives a ho-hum life. And if you're going to give your life to the Lord, that's great, but prepare to have had all of the fun that you're ever going to have, because from here on out, it's all solemn, anything but fun, which is not what God intended and not whatever He desired and not part of His best for us. I don't believe for a second, and I can't prove this, but I don't believe for a second that those 3 years that the apostles were walking with Jesus, that they were bored and miserable the whole time, because that's what God expected from them. If you get 12 guys together, I promise you that there was some things that happened that were probably stupid. They probably laughed at some really dumb things. They probably made some really stupid jokes, but I'm sure that there was some times that they had a lot of fun. And my guess is some of it was at Peter's expense, because he did a lot of dumb things. But for you and I, bringing it back to today, are you constantly pushing forward so hard that you don't take time to enjoy what God's given you? Are you so committed to accomplishing that next thing that you haven't taken time to celebrate and rest in all of what God's done for you and what He has given you? Do you remember the fact that, you may not be driving... I was watching this video of the new Rivians. I know some of you don't like electric cars, but these Rivians look really cool. And they have like 15 inches of clearance. That could go through almost anything. I'm guessing that could handle a Minnesota winter and a South Dakota winter and anything that we could throw at it. But anyway, it's an electric car, and I'm not sure how it handles in the cold, but that's a different conversation. But while I don't have that Rivian, I still have a car that's getting me from point A to B. And sometimes I can get hung up on thinking about what I don't have instead of being thankful for what I do. And I'm confident that car I have is going to get to 300,000 miles. It's almost there. And as a church, we can do the same thing. We can get so hung up on pushing forward. We have a desire that everybody in all of Moody County and all of the communities we touch would realize that they are loved by a holy God, and that they would know what it would be to have a relationship with them. And we could keep pushing to that, and we should keep pushing to that. But let's not forget to stop and celebrate what God's doing along the way and what He has done along the way. We're going to get a chance to have a little conversation afterwards, and I'm going to ask you these questions. I think they're on the back of your note sheet if you got one. But we're going to talk about celebrating. And we may even have this conversation. I don't even know if I have this in there, but what's something that we should celebrate as people? What's something we should celebrate as a church? Are there things that we need to do a better job of celebrating? So we're going to get to that in a little bit, but in the meantime, we're going to take some time now to celebrate communion. As we celebrate communion, we can look back at at the first communion. The first communion, it's in Matthew 26 and a couple other places, but this is Jesus with his apostles, and they're up in the upper room, and they're sitting around. And even in that, this is a celebration that's coming with Jesus knowing that he's about to die. He's just got done correcting his apostles because none of them were humble enough to wash each other's feet because they were all too good for it. All that's happened around him, and he takes a minute and celebrates this meal with them. And it says he took the bread, and when he had given it thanks, he broke it and gave it to his disciples, saying, "Take, eat, this is my body." And then he took the cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, saying, "Drink from it, all of you. This is the blood of my covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins." We're going to look ahead here in just a minute, and we're going to read in 1 Corinthians where we look back on that. And we're to continue.
Thank you for listening to this recent message from the Rescue Church. We pray that God will use this message to encourage, challenge, and inspire you in your faith journey. To hear our messages live, head to one of our physical campuses. If you'd like to learn more about the Rescue Church, please visit us online at therescuechurch.com or email us at office@therescuechurch.com.